The low murmur of the gilded quill was a carefully curated soundscape, a symphony of quiet power played on a keyboard of clinking crystal silver and hushed consequential whispers. From his throne-like booth in the corner, Alistair Finch surveyed his kingdom. He was not a king by birth but by conquest, a titan of the commodities market who saw the world not as a home, but as a trove of assets waiting to be liquidated. Across the polished mahogany table, Marcus Thorne, his junior vice president, a man whose ambition was eclipsed only by his sycophancy, nodded with the practiced rhythm of a bobblehead doll. Seated between them, the prize of the evening, was Edward Sterling, a scion of old Boston money, a man whose family fund was the final piece Alistair needed for his latest, most audacious venture. Their waitress approached, a young woman, barely out of her teens it seemed, with a cascade of dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that held a weariness far beyond her years. To Alistair, she was part of the decor, a functional automaton in a crisp black apron. He was about to close a deal that would gut a nation's resources and make him a billionaire twice over. She was an interruption, and so he leaned toward Sterling, a conspiratorial smirk twisting his lips, and switched to the clipped, guttural tones of Dutch. He spoke with the confidence of a man who believed his secrets were wrapped in a language as impenetrable as a vault door. He was about to learn that some vaults have a hidden key and some automatons have ghosts in their wiring capable of bringing the entire gilded facade crashing down. The ache in Ilara Vance's lower back was a familiar companion, a dull, insistent throb that had been her shadow for the past 2 years. It was a world away from the satisfying burn in her thighs after a long day in the field, chipping at rock formations under a hot sun, the scent of dust and discovery in her nostrils. Those days were gone, buried under an avalanche of disgrace and sorrow. Now her world was the hushed, oppressive opulence of the Gilded Quill, a Michelin-starred mausoleum in the heart of Boston's Beacon Hill. Her sensible, non-slip shoes, a far cry from her sturdy hiking boots, padded silently over Persian rugs that cost more than her entire college tuition. Every shift was a performance. She was not Ilara Vance, 22 years old, once the most promising geology undergraduate at MIT, the daughter of a brilliant, ruined man. She was just Miss, an efficient, smiling cipher. She had perfected the art of selective invisibility, of appearing precisely when a water glass dipped below the halfway mark and disappearing before she could register as a human being in the periphery of the powerful. She carried plates of seared foie gras and deconstructed bouillabaisse as if they were sacred relics. To her patrons, they represented an evening's indulgence. To her, they were the weight of a life she never wanted. Tonight, the air was particularly thick with the scent of entitlement and aged leather. The city's financial predators were out in force, their quiet laughter the sound of victories Ilara could no longer fathom. She moved among them, a ghost in the machine of their comfort, her practiced smile a mask that never quite reached her tired, intelligent gray eyes. Her manager, a stern but fair woman named Mrs. Gable, had pulled her aside at the start of the shift. "You have table 4, Ilara. Alistair Finch." The name was spoken with a mixture of reverence and dread. "Keep your head down. Answer only when spoken to. The man is a piranha in a Savile Row suit." Ilara knew the name. The whole city did, especially the academic enclaves of Cambridge. Alistair Finch, the founder of Finch Global Resources, was a modern-day robber baron. He didn't build companies, he consumed them, specializing in acquiring mineral rights and intellectual property through methods that were famously, brutally efficient. His face, all sharp angles and predatory stillness, was a fixture in financial journals. He was a shark, and the Gilded Quill was one of his preferred hunting grounds. As she approached the table, the shift in atmospheric pressure was palpable. Alistair Finch was even more imposing in person, dressed in a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. His hair was the color of steel, swept back from a high forehead, and his eyes, a pale, cold blue, seemed to be constantly appraising, calculating, and dismissing. Marcus Thorne, his deputy, was a symphony of nervous energy, while Edward Sterling, the older gentleman, possessed an air of weary calm. His suit was just as expensive as Finch's, but worn with an ease that suggested the money was generations old, not freshly clawed from the earth. "A bottle of the 82 Mouton Rothschild," Finch commanded without looking up from his menu, his voice a low rumble that expected and received immediate compliance. It was a test, a way to gauge the restaurant's pedigree and the server's competence. "An excellent vintage, sir," Alara replied, her voice a carefully modulated monotone. She did not gush. She did not offer an anecdote about the vineyard. She simply acknowledged the order and retreated. That was the rule of survival here. Be efficient, be deferential, be utterly forgettable. She returned with the wine, presenting it to Finch with the practiced reverence of a priestess. He gave a cursory glance at the label before nodding curtly, his attention already back on Mr. Sterling. Alara uncorked it with a quiet sigh of escaping air and poured a small tasting. Finch swirled the deep garnet liquid, sniffed it with the concentration of a bomb disposal expert, and took a sip. He held it in his mouth for a moment, then swallowed. "Acceptable," he pronounced not to her, but to the room at large. Alara filled the glasses, her movements economical and precise. Marcus Thorne watched her every move, as if she might suddenly upend the priceless vintage onto the immaculate linen. "The key to our strategy in Suriname, Edward," Finch was saying, his English crisp and patrician, "is understanding that the current government is sentimental. They see bauxite deposits. We see a massively undervalued source of rare earth elements, specifically neodymium and dysprosium, critical for next-generation EV batteries." Mr. Sterling swirled his own wine, his expression unreadable. Professor Vance's research was quite definitive on that point. The name hit Alara like a physical blow. Her hand holding the heavy bottle faltered for a microsecond before her training took over. She completed the pour for Marcus Thorne, her face a neutral mask, but inside a cold, sickening dread was beginning to uncoil. Professor Vance, her father. Vance was a brilliant geologist, Finch conceded with a dismissive wave of his hand. A terrible businessman. He published his preliminary findings, trying to build an academic consensus for ethical extraction. He might as well have put a sign on his door that said, "Please steal my life's work." Alara felt the blood drain from her face. She stepped back from the table, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She moved to a nearby service station, pretending to organize silverware, her ears straining to catch every venomous word. This wasn't just a random, arrogant billionaire. This was him, the man who had destroyed her father, the man who had taken everything. 2 years ago, Professor Alistair Vance had been on the verge of a breakthrough. His geological surveys of a remote region in Suriname, funded by a university grant, had uncovered one of the world's richest, most accessible deposits of rare earth minerals. His life's mission was to develop a new, environmentally sustainable method of extraction. He had shared his early data with a select few colleagues and potential investors, including a discreet inquiry from a subsidiary of Finch Global Resources. Then, the nightmare began. A rival academic, funded by an anonymous source, published a paper that used Vance's own data, subtly altered, to claim the discovery as his own and to discredit Vance's extraction methodology as inefficient and dangerous. Key digital files from Vance's university server were wiped. His reputation was shattered. The university, fearing a lawsuit from the new patent holder, launched an internal investigation that focused not on the theft, but on Vance's careless handling of proprietary data. The stress triggered a massive stroke, leaving the once vibrant professor a ghost of himself, confined to a nursing home, his mind a fractured mirror of its former brilliance. The anonymous source, Alara had always known in her gut, was Finch, and now he was sitting at her table, trying to leverage her father's stolen work to court a new investor. She had to stay calm. She had to be invisible. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of ash, and forced herself to continue her duties. Her only concern had been getting through the shift. Now her only concern was getting through the next 5 minutes without screaming. The meal unfolded in a slow-motion horror film. Alara served them their appetizers, oysters for Finch, a beet salad for Sterling, her hands moving with a steadiness she didn't feel. Finch held court, his voice a relentless torrent of self-aggrandizement. He was trying to win over Sterling. That much was obvious. The deal, codenamed Project Cerberus, was the prize. Perhaps feeling that the presence of the waitstaff was an impediment to true candor, or perhaps simply to showcase his worldliness, Finch switched to Dutch. He likely assumed it was a cloak of invisibility, a secure channel in the heart of Boston. What were the odds that a young waitress, probably a fine arts major from a state school, would understand the language of Amsterdam's financial district? The odds in his mind were zero. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial register. Dus Edward, het punt is dat de Surinaamse regering zwak is. Een stelletje idealisten die vasthouden aan het verleden. So, Edward, the point is, the Surinamese government is weak, a bunch of idealists clinging to the past. The language struck Alara not like a sound, but like a memory. It was the language of her childhood, the language her father spoke to her, Oma, and Opa in video calls, the language of the lullabies he sang to her. Her hands, polishing a wine glass, froze for a bare second before she forced them into motion again. Don't react. You are furniture. Marcus Thorne, ever the sycophant, chimed in with his own, less polished, accented Dutch. Absoluut. Onze interne projecties tonen aan dat we de operationele kosten met 40% kunnen verlagen zodra we de ethische protocollen van Vance overboord gooien. Absolutely. Our internal projections show we can cut operating costs by 40% once we jettison Vance's ethical protocols. Project Cerberus. The name echoed in the hollowed-out chambers of Alara's memory. It was the name of the file folder on her father's computer that had contained all his most sensitive research, the folder that had been digitally erased. The cold dread in her stomach was now mixing with a white-hot, volcanic rage. These men weren't just patrons. They were grave robbers, feasting on the bones of her father's legacy. This was the moment her life had fractured into a million pieces. She needed to hear more. Under the pretense of refilling their water glasses, she approached the table, her steps deliberate and silent. She kept her eyes downcast, focusing on the cascade of Voss water into baccarat crystal, her face a blank canvas of professional servitude. Finch, now fully in his element, gestured dismissively with his fork in her general direction. Je moet deze mensen gewoon negeren, he said, a cruel smirk on his lips. Ze zijn slechts onderdeel van het decor. You just have to ignore these people. They're merely part of the decor. He then looked at Alara, but his eyes passed through her as if she were a pane of glass. He lowered his voice, speaking to Thorne but ensuring Sterling could hear. Kijk naar haar, waarschijnlijk een mislukte kunstenares. Een mooi leeg gezicht, goed genoeg om het gepeupel te bedienen, maar geen enkele gedachte erachter. Look at her, probably a failed artist. A pretty, empty face, good enough to serve the rabble, but not a single thought behind it. Thorne gave a nervous, high-pitched chuckle. Zolang ze doet wat haar gezegd wordt, he added, as long as she does what she's told. The insult was so casual, so profoundly dehumanizing, it was like a slap. It wasn't the words themselves, but the context, spoken by the architect of her family's ruin, layered on top of the confirmation of his crimes. The weariness in her body vanished, incinerated by a surge of pure adrenaline. The ghost of her father was no longer a sorrowful memory. He was sitting at table 4, eating a $200 steak and mocking her in her mother tongue. Throughout this exchange, Edward Sterling had remained silent. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his water, and for a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, his eyes met Alara's. There was no pity in his gaze, but there was a flicker of something else, a keen, analytical intelligence, a deep, unnerving stillness. He was a witness. Finch, oblivious, pressed on, outlining the final stages of his plan. Zodra de deal met u rond is, Edward, leggen we de laatste hand aan de onteigening. We hebben een man binnen hun ministerie van Natuurlijke Hulpbronnen. De zogenaamde milieu-impact-studies zullen een wassen neus zijn. De vindingen van Vance zijn van ons en hij is te gebroken om er ooit nog iets tegen te doen. Once the deal with you is finalized, Edward, we'll complete the expropriation. We have a man inside their Ministry of Natural Resources. The so-called environmental impact studies will be a rubber stamp. Vance's findings are ours, and he's too broken to ever fight back. Too broken, the words twisted in Alara's gut. She finished pouring the water, her hand a marvel of steady control. She placed the carafe back on her tray, her mind a supercomputer processing years of grief, injustice, and simmering rage into a single, crystalline point of clarity. She wasn't just a waitress. She was Alara Vance, daughter of Alistair Vance, and she remembered everything. The remainder of the main course was a blur. Alara moved on autopilot, her mind a maelstrom of Dutch phrases, geological charts, and the face of her father, slack-jawed and confused in his hospital bed. The rage had cooled, compressed into a diamond-hard core of purpose. This wasn't just a random encounter. It was a reckoning. An opportunity had fallen from the sky, wrapped in cruelty and arrogance. A terrifying, dangerous, and absolutely irresistible opportunity. She served them their dessert, a rich chocolate torte for Finch and Thorne, a simple lemon sorbet for Mr. Sterling. The Dutch conversation continued, a litany of greed and self-congratulation. Finch was boasting now, recounting a similar corporate raid in Congo, casually mentioning pacifying the locals as if he were discussing pest control. Finally, the meal concluded. The plates were cleared. The last of the Rothschild was gone. Alistair Finch leaned back, patting his stomach with the smug satisfaction of a well-fed python. He caught Alara's eye and snapped his fingers, a gesture of such pure, unvarnished entitlement, it made her teeth ache. "The check," he commanded in English. Then as she turned to retrieve it, he couldn't resist one final, dismissive jab in Dutch for the benefit of his companions. "Schiet op, meisje. We hebben belangrijkere dingen te doen dan te wachten tot jij je slome voetjes hierheen sleept. Hurry up, girl. We have more important things to do than wait for you to drag your slow little feet over here." Alara stopped dead. Her back was to the table. In that moment, the entire restaurant, the clatter of cutlery, the murmur of patrons, the distant wail of a city siren, dissolved into an irrelevant hum. There was only table 4 and the echo of his words. "Hurry up, girl." She took a slow, deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs like fuel. She could walk away. She could bring the check, accept the insult, accept the paltry tip he would undoubtedly leave, and disappear back into the shadows of her life. It was the safe path, the sensible path. But 2 years of swallowing her pride, of choking on injustice, of mourning a life that had been stolen from her, it was over. She turned. She walked back to the table, not with the hurried, deferential shuffle of a waitress, but with the steady, grounded gait of a field geologist traversing solid rock. She held no billfolder. Her hands were empty, clasped loosely before her. She fixed her gaze directly on Alistair Finch, holding it until he was forced, with visible annoyance, to acknowledge her as more than a piece of moving scenery. Alara offered him a smile. It was not her waitress smile, the practiced, vacant curve of her lips. This smile was sharp, precise, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the smile of a predator that has just realized the trap it has laid is not for its prey, but for itself. And then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, yet it sliced through the restaurant's ambient murmur with the chilling clarity of a scalpel. Her Dutch was not the colloquial Dutch of the street. It was the formal, academic Hoog Netherlands of a university, spoken with the perfect diction hewn from years of listening to her father lecture. "Verontschuldiging, mijnheer," she began, her tone impeccably level. "De rekening komt zo aan, maar ik voel me genoodzaakt u op een paar dingen te wijzen." "Pardon me, sir. The bill will be right out. But I feel compelled to point out a few things to you." The effect was instantaneous. It was seismic. Alistair Finch's smug expression did not just fall, it shattered into 1,000 pieces of disbelief. His jaw went slack, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth. He looked at her as if she were an alien who had just sprouted from the center of the table. Marcus Thorne froze, a piece of torte on his fork, his face blanching to the color of curdled milk. He darted a terrified look from Alara to Finch and back again, pure, unadulterated panic in his eyes. The only person at the table who did not look shocked was Edward Sterling. He simply set his coffee cup down with a soft click, placed his napkin neatly on the table, leaned forward ever so slightly, and watched Ilara with an expression of intense, undivided, and utterly fascinated interest. Ilara continued, her gaze locked on Finch like a targeting system. Ten eerste, uw grammatica is wat slordig als u een dame aanspreekt. Zelfs als ze slechts een serveerster is. Juffrouw zou passender zijn dan meisje. Het getuigt van een gebrek aan respect. Firstly, your grammar is a bit sloppy when addressing a lady, even if she is just a waitress. Miss would be more appropriate than girl. It shows a lack of respect. She let the grammatical correction hang in the air, a small, precise incision that was about so much more than language. It was a direct challenge to his entire worldview. Finch finally found his voice, sputtering in a clumsy mix of Dutch and English. What denk je wel niet dat je doet? Who the hell do you think you are? Ilara's smile tightened. She quoted Marcus Thorne's earlier, sycophantic remark back at them. Ik doe gewoon wat mij gezegd wordt. Dat is toch het enige dat telt. I'm just doing what I'm told. That's all that matters, right? Her voice was laced with ice. Maar soms hoort men dingen. Bijvoorbeeld dat Project Cerberus de protocollen van professor Vance wil overboord gooien om kosten te besparen. Of dat zijn bevindingen over neodymium en dysprosium van hem gestolen zijn. Bevindingen die nu van u zijn, omdat hij te gebroken is om er tegen te vechten. But sometimes one overhears things. For example, that Project Cerberus aims to jettison Professor Vance's protocols to save costs, or that his findings on neodymium and dysprosium were stolen from him. Findings that are now yours because he is too broken to fight back. Every word was a perfectly aimed blow. Thorne dropped his fork. It landed on his dessert plate with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the suddenly silent bubble that had formed around their table. Finch's face, already pale, had turned a ghastly, waxy white. The blood had fled, leaving behind a mask of pure horror. He was seeing her now, truly seeing her for the first time, and in his eyes a dreadful, dawning recognition was beginning to bloom. He didn't know who she was yet, but he knew with sickening certainty that she was not a waitress. She was a witness. She was a threat. The bubble of silence around table 4 was now so thick it felt like a physical presence. Nearby diners, sensing the shift in the room's energy, began to cast curious glances. Alistair Finch stared at Ilara, his formidable mind, accustomed to hostile takeovers and boardroom ambushes, utterly paralyzed. He was a master of calculating variables, of predicting market shifts and human greed. But he had never in all his meticulous planning accounted for a variable like this. A ghost from his past, wearing a waitress's apron. He tried to wrest back control, to fall back on the blustering authority that had served him so well. Dit is absurd, he snarled in Dutch, his voice a low, guttural growl that lacked its usual conviction. U heeft geen idee waar u het over heeft. U heeft een privégesprek afgeluisterd. Dat is reden voor ontslag op staande voet. This is absurd. You have no idea what you're talking about. You've been eavesdropping on a private conversation. That's grounds for immediate dismissal. Ilara did not flinch. The fear that had been her constant companion for 2 years was being systematically burned away by the righteous inferno of the moment. Oh, ik denk dat ik precies weet waar ik het over heb, meneer Finch, she replied, her Dutch still flawlessly formal, a stark contrast to his agitated rasp. Project Cerberus is geen nieuw plan. Het is een oud plan van 2 jaar geleden. Destijds werd het gepromoot door een lege vennootschap, Trident Acquisitions, om de ware investeerders te verhullen. Investeerders zoals bijvoorbeeld Finch Global Resources. Oh, I believe I know exactly what I'm talking about, Mr. Finch. Project Cerberus isn't a new plan. It's an old one, from 2 years ago. Back then it was promoted by a shell company, Trident Acquisitions, to disguise the true investors. Investors like, for example, Finch Global Resources. At the mention of Trident Acquisitions, Marcus Thorne made a small, strangled sound, like a drowning man. It was an old entity, buried deep in their corporate structure, a legal tool used for their most aggressive and ethically ambiguous operations. For this girl to know that name was not just impossible, it was terrifying. Finch's eyes narrowed. The bluster was gone, replaced by a cold reptilian focus. "Who are you?" he demanded, switching back to English, as if the language itself could be a shield. This was it, the moment of truth. Ilara stood a little taller, and for the first time that night, she let the weary, subservient mask of the waitress fall away completely. In its place was the face of the brilliant, incisive young scientist she had once been, her gray eyes shining with fierce intelligence. "My name," she said, speaking slowly and deliberately, her English as crisp and clear as her Dutch had been, "is Ilara Vance." She let the name hang in the charged air. To Marcus Thorne, it meant nothing. But she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Alistair Finch. She saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes, followed by a frantic, high-speed search through his mental archives of enemies, rivals, and obstacles. And then she saw the exact moment he found it. The moment the last puzzle piece clicked into place. His face transformed, going from ashen white to the color of bleached bone. It was a look of pure, primal horror. He remembered. "Professor Alistair Vance is my father," Ilara continued, her voice resonating with the weight of 2 years of suppressed grief and anger. "I was his research assistant at MIT. I was the one who logged the core samples and mapped the geological strata for what you now call Project Cerberus. You didn't just steal his research, you stole his life. You used a puppet academic to publish his work, you erased his data, and you left him to be crucified by his own university. You thought you had erased him. You thought you had erased me." She took a single, deliberate step closer to the table, leaning in slightly, her voice dropping to an intense, carrying whisper. "You hid behind your shell companies and your high-priced lawyers, but you underestimated him. You underestimated me. You thought I was just some empty-faced girl, part of the decor. But you just confessed to industrial espionage, bribery, and conspiracy to commit fraud in front of a new potential business partner. You didn't just order dinner, Mr. Finch. You ordered your own destruction." Alistair Finch, the Titan, the Predator, the king of the gilded quill, was utterly, profoundly speechless. He looked as if he had seen a ghost, and in a way, he had. The ghost of a life he had callously destroyed had just served him his after-dinner coffee. Marcus Thorne looked as if he was about to vomit directly onto the white linen tablecloth. He was a junior officer and accomplice, but not the architect. He was merely a passenger on a luxury yacht that had just struck an iceberg. Then a new voice entered the fray. A calm, measured, and deeply resonant voice. Edward Sterling, who had watched the entire exchange with the quiet, unnerving intensity of a chess grandmaster, folded his hands on the table. He looked at Ilara, and for the first time he spoke directly to her, his tone imbued with a respect that no one else at the table had shown her. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice carrying an immense quiet authority, "your father's name is well known to me. His papers on sustainable extraction were groundbreaking. I was unaware of the circumstances of his retirement." He then turned his cool, discerning gaze upon Alistair Finch, who seemed to shrink under its weight. "Alistair, I believe our dinner is concluded, as is our potential partnership. Sterling Consolidated does not do business with thieves. We most certainly do not do business with men who wage war on scholars and their children." With that, Edward Sterling stood up, a towering figure of old-world dignity. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible, but deeply respectful nod to Ilara, not to Finch, and then turned and walked away from the table without a single backward glance, leaving a stunned silence and the smoldering wreckage of Alistair Finch's evening, his deal, and quite possibly his entire empire. The departure of Edward Sterling was like a judge's gavel striking, its echo signaling the end of the proceedings. The spell of horrified paralysis that had held Alistair Finch captive finally broke. His face, once a mask of shock, contorted into a dark, thunderous cloud of pure fury and abject humiliation. "You!" he hissed at Ilara, his voice a low, trembling vibrato of rage. He pointed a shaking finger at her. "You're finished. You think this is a victory? I will crush you. I will have you blacklisted from every establishment in this city. You'll be scrubbing toilets in a bus station for the rest of your miserable life. Do you hear me?" His voice was rising, a venomous crescendo that began to slice through the restaurant's decorum. Diners at adjacent tables were now openly staring, their forks paused midair, sensing the raw, ugly drama unfolding. Mrs. Gable, the manager, her face a grim mask of concern, was already striding purposefully toward their table from across the room. Ilara stood her ground. The threats that would have sent her spiraling into a panic yesterday now seemed pathetic, the toothless snarls of a cornered animal. "You already did your worst to me, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice impossibly steady. "You took my father's health. You took his reputation. You took my future. You think threatening my job as a waitress scares me now?" She allowed herself a small, cold smile. "You just admitted to multiple felonies in front of a witness whose family fund manages $50 billion. I think you have far bigger problems than me." Just then, Mrs. Gable arrived, her presence a bastion of managerial authority. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Finch?" she asked, her tone firm but professionally neutral. This waitress," Finch sputtered, gesturing wildly at Ilara. "She's insane. She has been harassing my guests, making outlandish, slanderous accusations. I want her fired, immediately." Mrs. Gable looked from Finch's apoplectic face to Ilara's unnervingly calm one. She had been in the service industry for 30 years. She could distinguish between a hysterical employee and a millionaire having a meltdown. "Ilara," she said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly, "why don't you go to the back and take a break? I will handle this." "She's not taking a break. She is fired," Finch roared, his fist hitting the table, rattling the silverware. "Actually," Ilara said, her voice cutting through his tirade. She reached up and unpinned the small, elegant brass name tag from her apron. She placed it gently on the table, next to Finch's half-eaten, obscenely expensive chocolate torte. "I quit." She looked at her manager, her expression shifting to one of genuine apology. "I'm sorry for the scene, Mrs. Gable." Mrs. Gable simply shook her head slightly, a flicker of something, understanding, respect, perhaps even pride in her eyes. "Go on, dear. It's all right." As Ilara turned to walk away from the carnage of her former life, a hand gently touched her arm. She spun around, half expecting a final confrontation. It was Edward Sterling. He had not left the restaurant but had waited for her near the grand arched entrance. In his hand, he held out a simple, yet impossibly elegant business card. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice low and serious, "what Alistair Finch did to your father was a travesty. What he planned to do in Suriname is a sickness in my industry. My flight back to New York isn't until Friday morning. I would be very interested to hear your full story. My lawyers are formidable. Perhaps we have mutual interests." Ilara looked down at the card. The heavy cream-colored stock was embossed with just a name and a number. Edward Sterling. It felt impossibly heavy in her hand, a lifeline thrown from the most unexpected quarter imaginable. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," she managed to say, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. I will call you." He gave another short, respectful nod and was gone, disappearing into a waiting black car that materialized at the curb. Ilara walked through the swinging doors of the kitchen, past the stunned, curious faces of her now former colleagues. She didn't stop at her locker to gather her things. She walked straight out the back service entrance and into the cool, damp Boston night. She leaned against the rough brick wall of the alley, the scent of garbage and rain a strange, grounding perfume. The adrenaline that had sustained her began to recede, leaving her shaking, not from fear but from release. She had done it. She had faced the monster that had haunted her family's life, and in one spectacular, terrifying act of defiance, had blown up her quiet, miserable existence. She was jobless. She had no plan. But for the first time in 2 long, soul-crushing years, she felt the exhilarating, terrifying lightness of being free. The ghost of her father was no longer a weight on her shoulders. She had finally given him a voice. Back inside the gilded quill, Alistair Finch was left to marinate in the ruins. His deal was dead. His reputation with a major player was not just damaged, but vaporized. And a ghost from his past now had a name, a face, and a powerful new potential ally. As he slapped his black credit card on the table to pay the exorbitant bill, his mind was not on the money. It was on one thing: silencing Alara Vance. For good this time. The first domino had fallen, and it had landed squarely on him. The war was only just beginning. The 24 hours after Alara walked out of the alley behind the Gilded Quill were a disorienting blend of terror and elation. The initial intoxicating rush of righteous victory soon gave way to the cold, stark dawn of reality. She was unemployed, her savings were a joke, and she had made a mortal enemy of a man with limitless resources and non-existent scruples. Every creak of her apartment building's old floors, every siren in the distance, sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She spent the day in her small Cambridge apartment, a place chosen for its proximity to MIT, a proximity that now felt like a cruel joke. Edward Sterling's business card sat on her worn kitchen table like a holy relic or a ticking bomb. She couldn't decide which. Was his offer genuine? Men of his class and power were sharks, just like Finch, only with better manners. Was he merely seeking leverage, a tool to wound a business rival, a tool he would discard once it had served its purpose? By morning, the fear had not subsided, but a cold, hard resolve had formed around it. Finch had already taken everything that mattered. There were no more retreats left. There was only the fight. With a deep, steadying breath, she dialed the number on the card. A clipped, professional voice answered. "Mr. Sterling's office." "My name is Alara Vance," she said, her own voice sounding strange to her ears. He asked me to call." There was no hesitation. "Of course, Miss Vance, Mr. Sterling is expecting you. He has arranged a car. It will be at your address in 30 minutes. The car was not a flashy limousine, but a discreet, armored sedan that took her not to a sterile downtown office, but to a historic brownstone on Commonwealth Avenue, the headquarters of Sterling Consolidated. She was led not into a waiting room, but directly into a vast, book-lined study where Edward Sterling stood waiting by a fireplace. He was not alone. With him was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, whom he introduced as Eleanor Vance. No relation, a wry smile confirmed. The head of his corporate council. There were no pleasantries. For the next 3 hours, Alara told her story. She laid out everything, starting with her father's initial research, his passion for ethical science, the first discreet inquiries from Trident Acquisitions, and the sudden, catastrophic campaign of sabotage that followed. She spoke of the altered data, the stolen files, the university's betrayal, and the devastating impact on her father's health. She spoke not with self-pity, but with the cool, analytical precision of a scientist presenting evidence. Sterling and his lawyer listened without interruption, their expressions grim. When she finished, Eleanor Vance spoke first, her voice calm but with an edge of steel. "What you're describing, Miss Vance, is Alistair Finch's signature move. The Finch method, they call it in some circles. He identifies brilliant but underfunded research, uses shell companies to engage, and then employs sabotage and legal intimidation to acquire the intellectual property for pennies on the dollar. It's a pattern, but proving it is another matter. He's a master at burying his tracks. To win this, we need more than your testimony," Eleanor continued. "We need a smoking gun, the original, untampered data from your father's server." "It's gone," Alara said, the old familiar wave of hopelessness washing over her. "It was on the university's main research server. When they suspended him, his access was revoked. The IT department told me the files were wiped as per protocol during the investigation." "Perhaps," Mr. Sterling said, speaking for the first time since she had arrived. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her. "But men like Alistair are driven by supreme arrogance. Arrogance breeds carelessness. And academics are creatures of habit. Think, Miss Vance, your father. Was he paranoid? Did he trust the university's digital security completely?" Alara's mind raced back. Her father, a man who grew up in the Cold War era, had a healthy distrust of centralized systems. He was always talking about digital decay, solar flares, the vulnerability of the cloud. He was meticulous, almost pathologically so. And then it hit her, a memory so mundane she had almost forgotten it. Her father, sitting in his cluttered home office late at night, a strange beige-colored box connected to his computer. "The Iomega discs," she whispered, her eyes widening. "He used to make backups on old magneto-optical discs. He called them his digital fossils. He said they were immune to magnetic pulses and server crashes. He kept them I think in his old filing cabinet, the one that was moved to a university storage facility after he left." Eleanor Vance's eyes lit up. "That's our starting point. We'll file a motion for access to his personal effects in university storage. We'll cite a need to retrieve family records. It's thin, but it's a legitimate reason." Just as this new fragile hope was being born, Ilara's phone buzzed. An unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. "Hello? Is this Ilara Vance?" The voice was nervous, hesitant, with a faint accent she couldn't place. "Who is this?" "You don't know me. My name is Dr. Ben Carter. I was a postdoc in your father's department." The man took a shaky breath. "I was there when they investigated him. It was a sham, Miss Vance. A complete sham. The man they brought in to lead the technical review of the data breach, the one who wrote the report concluding your father was negligent, he wasn't a university employee. He was an outside contractor, a man named Marcus Thorne." Ilara felt the floor drop out from under her. Marcus Thorne, Finch's sycophantic dinner guest. The whole investigation had been an inside job, orchestrated from the very beginning. "Why are you telling me this now?" Ilara asked, her voice trembling. "I saw an article this morning," Dr. Carter said, his voice dropping. "A small piece on a financial blog. It mentioned the Sterling Consolidated partnership with Finch Global on Project Cerberus had been abruptly terminated after a dramatic incident at the Gilded Quill. It mentioned Finch by name. I've lived with the guilt for 2 years. Your father was a good man. What they did to him was wrong. Thorne was a snake. He copied everything. A transatlantic alliance of the willing had just been forged. Ilara's intimate knowledge, Sterling's immense resources, and now a key witness from inside the conspiracy. The hunt was no longer just for digital fossils. They now had a name, a location, and a target. The war against Alistair Finch was about to become very real. The next 3 weeks were a blur of methodical, relentless activity. The quiet study in the Commonwealth Avenue brownstone became a war room. Whiteboards were filled with timelines, corporate structures, and names. The air hummed with the quiet intensity of a high-stakes legal battle taking shape. Ilara, for the first time in 2 years, felt alive. The weariness was gone, replaced by a sharp, analytical fire. She was no longer a victim. She was a strategist. Eleanor Vance moved with the precision of a master surgeon. Her first step was a carefully worded legal request to the university for access to Professor Vance's stored effects. As expected, the university's counsel stonewalled, citing ongoing legal sensitivities. "They're protecting themselves," Eleanor said grimly during a late-night strategy session. "Admitting a fraudulent investigation took place on their watch opens them up to massive liability. We need more leverage." That leverage came from Dr. Carter. Initially terrified of retribution, he was persuaded by Eleanor's assurances of legal protection to provide a sworn affidavit. He detailed how Marcus Thorne had been given unrestricted access to the university servers, how he had personally witnessed Thorne downloading terabytes of data, and how Thorne's final report was a preordained conclusion designed to scapegoat Professor Vance. Armed with this affidavit, Eleanor launched her assault. In a tense video conference with the university's general counsel, she laid out their position with chilling clarity. "We are not alleging a simple data breach," she began, her voice calm and measured. "We have a sworn witness stating that your institution was actively complicit in a fraudulent investigation, orchestrated by an outside party to facilitate the theft of intellectual property. Refusing to grant access to Professor Vance's personal archives will be interpreted as an attempt to conceal evidence. Mr. Sterling is a significant benefactor of this university. I am sure he would be disappointed to learn that his donations were funding an institution that preys upon its own faculty." The threat, combining legal force with the immense financial and reputational weight of the Sterling name, worked. Within 24 hours, Ilara and two of Eleanor's junior associates were granted access to a dusty, climate-controlled storage unit in the university's sub-basement. The room was a time capsule of her father's life. Boxes of old textbooks, geological maps, rock samples, and in the corner, a heavy four-drawer metal filing cabinet. Ilara's hands trembled as she inserted the key. In the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of old lecture notes, was a beige plastic case. Inside, nestled in protective foam, were 5 I-Omega magneto-optical discs, each meticulously labeled. Cerberus data, raw, unfiltered. The next 72 hours were agonizing. The discs were an obsolete format. Eleanor had to hire a specialist, a data recovery expert, who worked out of a cluttered lab in an industrial park. Ilara paced the study, unable to eat or sleep. What if the data had degraded? What if the disks were corrupted? On the third day, the call came. The specialist's voice was filled with excitement. "I got it," he said. "It's all here. Every last byte. Geological surveys, mineral composition analyses, extraction simulations. It's a gold mine. And I found something else. The disk contains a hidden encrypted partition. It's a log file. It looks like your father's computer was running a keylogger and a background file transfer tracker." When they decrypted the log file, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. It was a complete record of Marcus Thorne's digital intrusion. It showed his IP address logging into her father's server. It recorded the exact moment he downloaded the Cerberus directory. And the final damning piece of evidence. It recorded an outbound encrypted data packet sent from Thorne's machine minutes later to an offshore server in the Cayman Islands. A server that Eleanor's team, through their own parallel investigation, had already definitively linked to Trident Acquisitions, Alistair Finch's shell corporation. They had him. The chain of evidence was complete, unbreakable, and absolute. The final act was not a courtroom drama. It was a swift, silent execution. Eleanor Vance did not file a lawsuit. Instead, she arranged a meeting, not with Alistair Finch, but with the board of directors of the publicly traded arm of his empire, Finch Global Resources. The meeting took place in a neutral, high-security conference room in New York. Ilara sat beside Eleanor and Mr. Sterling as the 7 board members, powerful men and women from the highest echelons of finance, filed in, their faces a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. Eleanor began without preamble. She didn't make accusations. She simply presented the evidence on a large screen. The sworn affidavit from Dr. Carter, the university server logs, the data from the magneto-optical disc, and finally, the unassailable transfer log showing company property being sent to an illegal offshore entity by Finch's own vice president. A heavy, shocked silence filled the room. The board members looked from the screen to each other, the color draining from their faces. They were not moralists, but they were pragmatists. They were staring at a scandal that would not only destroy Finch, but could crater their stock price and mire them in years of SEC investigations and shareholder lawsuits. "Mr. Finch has exposed this company to catastrophic legal and financial risk," Eleanor concluded, her voice like a death knell. "His actions constitute gross negligence and a profound breach of his fiduciary duty." Mr. Sterling spoke for the first time. "My fund holds a 7% stake in this company," he said quietly. "We will be voting for a change in leadership. Immediately. We will also be submitting this dossier to the authorities unless Mr. Finch is removed, and a comprehensive settlement is offered to Miss Vance and her father for the damages incurred. You have 24 hours. The coup was swift and bloodless. Faced with an open and shut case and a revolt from their largest institutional investor, the board acted decisively. An emergency meeting was called. Alistair Finch was fired. Marcus Thorne was fired and promptly arrested by federal agents on charges of corporate espionage. A week later, a formal settlement offer arrived. It was a staggering number, large enough to ensure her father would have the best medical care for the rest of his life and to compensate for the theft of what would have been a Nobel-worthy discovery. Looking at the papers, Ilara felt not elation, but a quiet, profound sense of peace. The money was secondary. It was the truth that mattered. Her future, once a terrifying blank space, was now an open horizon. Job offers flooded in from top firms, all eager to hire the brilliant young woman who had outmaneuvered the legendary Alistair Finch. But the thought of returning to that world, of playing the same game, felt like a betrayal. She met with Mr. Sterling one last time in the book-lined study. "You have a choice, Alara," he said. "You can go back into the arena, a much stronger player than before, or you can help rewrite the rules." He laid out a proposal: the Vance Institute for Ethical Science, a nonprofit foundation endowed by the settlement money and a matching contribution from Sterling Consolidated. Its mission would be to provide legal protection, funding, and support for independent researchers, ensuring that brilliant minds like her father would never again be vulnerable to predators like Finch. "It needs a director," Mr. Sterling said. "Someone with the mind of a scientist, the heart of a survivor, and the courage of a warrior. Someone who knows exactly what is at stake." Ilara looked out the window at the bustling Boston street. She had come to this city to study the Earth's history, written in layers of rock. Instead, she had been forced to navigate the treacherous geology of human greed. She would not be analyzing mineral deposits. She would be shielding the people who discovered them. She would be the guardian her father never had. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, the first truly joyful smile in years. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice clear and strong, "when do I start?"